She had been running her diner for more than a decade. Every morning she would open the heavy glass door, flip on the lights, and let the smell of freshly brewed coffee and sizzling bacon fill the small room. It wasn't much, just a modest little diner tucked between a convenience store and a gas station, but it had become a favorite spot for people in the neighborhood. Regulars knew her by sight and by name. Some came for the food, some came for her warmth, but almost everyone came for the way she made them feel seen. She knew when someone needed a kind word, a listening ear, or just a plate of something hot and comforting. She had learned to handle difficult situations over the years. In a neighborhood like this, you had to. People came from all walks of life, and the diner was a crossroads where everyone crossed paths. She never judged anyone, not really. Everyone had a story, she always said to herself. But she had never faced anything like what was about to happen on that warm evening in late spring. It had been a busy day, the kind where she barely had time to sit down. Orders were flying out of the kitchen: eggs, pancakes, burgers, coffee, sandwiches, and fries. The usual chatter of customers filled the room, laughter bouncing off the walls, plates clattering, servers moving quickly. By the time evening came, she was tired, ready to close up and finally breathe. She wiped down the counters, counted the cash, and started sweeping the floors. Then she heard the roar. It started as a distant rumble and quickly grew louder, a deep, throaty sound that made the windows tremble. She looked outside and saw a group of motorcycles speeding past. It was nothing unusual for the area. Bikers often passed through, but this was different. One bike had pulled up near the diner and stayed there. The rider, wearing a worn leather jacket and a helmet, sat for a moment, looking around nervously. There was a sense of urgency in the way he shifted on the seat, the way he kept glancing over his shoulder. Before she could get a closer look, a police car skidded to a stop in front of the diner. The flashing lights reflected off the windows, casting red and blue streaks across the floor. Two officers stepped out, their expression serious, eyes locked on the lone biker. Something about the way they moved, the way they spoke to each other in hushed but firm tones, made her heart race. She didn't know much about the biker at first, only that he looked tense, out of place, and clearly in some kind of trouble. She watched from behind the counter as the officers approached him. Their voices carried through the evening air, sharp and commanding. The biker hesitated, his hands twitching at his sides. There was no weapon in sight, just a man and a couple of cops. But the tension between them felt thick enough to cut through. Her instinct kicked in. She didn't know why, but something in her gut told her to step forward. She grabbed the diner's keys, opened the door, and walked outside. The night air was warm, carrying the scent of asphalt and exhaust. The biker looked at her through his helmet, eyes wide, unsure if she was friend or foe. The police officers, noticing her, frowned. "Ma'am, this is a restricted area. You shouldn't—" One officer started, but she cut him off. "This is private property," she said, her voice steady, firm but calm. "You can't come in here without a warrant. Please don't cause a scene in front of my customers." The biker seemed surprised, almost relieved. He took off his helmet, revealing a young man with a weathered face, a mix of exhaustion and anxiety. He muttered a thank you under his breath, but didn't move closer yet. The officers glanced at her, momentarily distracted by her confidence. She didn't know if it would work, but she wasn't about to back down. She had faced difficult people before and had learned how to hold her ground. "You can wait here if you like," she said to the biker, motioning toward the small outdoor patio. "I'll make sure you're safe until this clears up." One officer frowned, clearly frustrated. "Ma'am, you don't understand—" "I understand perfectly," she interrupted. "I'm not stopping you from doing your job, but I am asking you to respect this property and my decision. If there's nothing to pursue here, you need to leave." The biker slowly made his way toward the patio, grateful for her intervention. He kept glancing back at the officers, who muttered to each other and finally got back into their car, leaving the scene. She watched the red and blue lights fade in the distance, her pulse still racing. Once the officers were gone, she went outside to check on him. "You okay?" she asked gently. He nodded, but the tension in his shoulders didn't leave. I didn't know where else to go," he admitted. "I didn't want trouble, I got caught in the wrong place at the wrong time." She nodded, understanding more than he realized. "You're safe here. Just sit, relax, and I'll get you something to eat." Inside, she prepared a plate of food, simple but hearty: eggs, toast, some bacon, and coffee. She carried it outside and set it in front of him. He looked at her, unsure how to respond. Why are you helping me?" he asked, almost whispering. She smiled softly. "Because everyone deserves a chance to be treated fairly, and because no one should face danger alone." He didn't say anything after that, but he ate quietly, savoring each bite. She stayed nearby, keeping an eye on the street, ready for anything. For a moment, the world felt still. The roar of motorcycles, the flashing lights, the fear, it all seemed far away inside the calm bubble of her diner and the little patio. As he finished eating, he finally spoke. "I don't even know your name." "Doesn't matter," she said with a shrug. "Just know you're safe." He nodded, a mixture of relief and gratitude in his eyes. She didn't realize it at the time, but that one decision, simple as it seemed, would change everything. The night went on quietly after that. She closed up the diner, locked the doors, and made sure he had a safe place to rest. She didn't know the full story about who he was or why the police were after him. She only knew that he was human, in need, and she could help. And in that moment, she felt a strange sense of pride, not in herself, but in doing what was right. By the next morning, she had returned to her routine, sweeping the floors, serving breakfast to regulars, chatting with familiar faces. Life seemed normal again, but the memory of the night lingered. She didn't know it yet, but news of her courage had already begun to spread. In a world where actions speak louder than words, this small act of bravery would resonate far beyond the little diner on the corner. The next morning, the diner opened as usual. The smell of coffee and fried food filled the air, and the chatter of regular customers created a familiar, comforting rhythm. She went about her routine, serving pancakes, pouring coffee, and exchanging smiles with the people who had come to expect her warmth. She tried to push aside the events of the previous night, thinking it was just a one-time situation, a problem that had been resolved. But deep down, she couldn't shake the feeling that something had shifted, that the night had left a mark she didn't yet understand. It started subtly at first. A few customers, who were clearly not regulars, began to ask about the previous evening. "I heard some police were here last night," one man said as he sipped his coffee. "Everything okay?" She nodded with a smile, keeping her words simple. "Everything's fine," she said. "Just a small misunderstanding, that's all." But the questions kept coming. People seemed curious, almost in awe. She realized quickly that word traveled fast in the neighborhood. By mid-morning, whispers had started outside the diner. Some people had seen a few motorcycles parked briefly on the street. Others had heard about her standing up to the police. The details were fuzzy, but the impression was clear. She had done something bold. Inside, she focused on her customers. She didn't want to dwell on what had happened, and she certainly didn't want to encourage attention, but her mind kept drifting back to the young man she had protected. He had seemed nervous, almost haunted, and she wondered how things had ended for him once he left. She had offered him safety, food, and a place to sit, but she knew that the world outside her diner could be harsh, especially for someone in his position. Around noon, the doorbell chimed, and she looked up to see a man leaning against the counter. He was not a stranger exactly, but someone she didn't recognize immediately. His leather jacket, though worn, was distinct, and she noticed patches she had never seen before. He smiled faintly, almost shyly, and said, "I just wanted to thank you again for last night." She raised an eyebrow, a little surprised by the visit. "No need," she said. "I just did what anyone would do. You were in trouble, and I wanted to help." He shook his head. "Most people wouldn't," he said. "Not like that. You didn't flinch, you didn't hesitate, and you didn't make me feel judged or scared. Johanna, you saved me in a way I didn't expect." She felt a lump in her throat. It wasn't about recognition or praise for her, it was about understanding. Sometimes people acted bravely for no other reason than it was the right thing to do. She nodded and offered him a seat. "Sit, have some food. You've had a long night." As he ate, she noticed something in the way he carried himself. There was a quiet dignity, a kind of strength that didn't need to shout to be noticed. And yet there was also a weariness, a sign that he had been through situations that most people could never imagine. She asked him lightly about his life, and he shared just enough to paint a picture. A life on the road, close calls, friendships built on loyalty, and a constant struggle to stay out of trouble while being misunderstood at every turn. The conversation was slow, careful, but natural. She could see the relief in his eyes, the way he leaned back in the chair and finally exhaled. He had been tense, alert to every sound, every movement, but now he seemed to let go just for a moment. That moment, she realized, was why she had done what she did. It wasn't about heroes or gangs. It was about giving someone a small chance to breathe, a brief pause in a life that was often chaotic and unforgiving. By the afternoon, word had spread even further. Phones rang with curious questions, and messages arrived from people she didn't know. Some were bikers, some were friends of friends, all asking about the woman who had stood her ground and protected one of their own. She listened carefully to the tone of each call, surprised at the respect she was being shown. It wasn't admiration in the flashy, show-off kind of way. It was respect rooted in understanding and trust. She spent the rest of the day serving meals, wiping counters, and washing dishes, but her mind kept drifting to the impact of the previous night. She had acted without thinking too much, guided by instinct and compassion, yet somehow her small act of courage had resonated far beyond the walls of her diner. People were talking about her, sharing the story in ways she could barely comprehend. The young man returned later in the afternoon. He brought with him a few others, friends from the biker community. She was careful, but he assured her that they meant no harm. "We just want to say thanks," he said. "You don't know how much it means to us that someone would stand up like that." She studied them cautiously. They were big, intimidating men, covered in tattoos and leather, but their eyes carried a calmness, a respect that matched their words. They sat down, sharing stories quietly among themselves, occasionally glancing at her with nods of gratitude. She realized that her diner, a place she had always thought of as ordinary, had become something extraordinary, a place where trust, courage, and respect intersected in unexpected ways. Through the evening, more visitors came. Each one brought a new story, a new perspective, and all of them shared the same admiration. They weren't there to cause trouble or flaunt authority. They were there to honor her actions. She listened, nodded, and kept serving food, feeling a strange sense of humility. She hadn't done it for recognition, yet the recognition felt like a quiet, powerful affirmation that standing up for what was right could ripple outward in ways she hadn't imagined. As night fell, she cleaned the diner again, locking the doors and wiping down counters. Her thoughts wandered to what had begun as an ordinary evening, filled with cooking and serving, and how it had transformed into something she would never forget. She had protected a man who needed help, and in doing so, she had touched a part of a community she had only just begun to understand. That night, she sat in her small apartment above the diner, reflecting on the day. She didn't feel fear or regret, only a quiet satisfaction that she had acted with integrity. She knew that actions, even small ones, could leave lasting impressions. The biker had been one moment of decision, one act of courage, and it had already changed the way people saw her. She thought about the loyalty and respect she had witnessed in those brief interactions. It wasn't flashy or loud. It was quiet, deep, and meaningful. She realized that courage wasn't always about fighting or confrontation. It was about standing firm, being true to one's values, and offering help when it was needed. That understanding settled in her heart like a slow, steady warmth, the kind that doesn't fade easily. By the time she went to bed, she felt an unfamiliar sense of anticipation mixed with curiosity. She didn't know it yet, but the events of the next day would surpass anything she could imagine. Her life, usually predictable and comfortable, was about to intersect with a world far larger and more intense than her little diner. And through it all, she would remain grounded, relying on the same courage, calm, and integrity that had guided her the night before. In the quiet of her apartment, she finally allowed herself to rest, unaware of the extraordinary response her act of bravery had already set in motion. The morning sunlight spilled through the diner's windows, painting the room in warm shades of gold. She arrived early as usual, unlocking the doors and flicking on the lights. The smell of coffee and fried food filled the space immediately, and she took a deep breath, letting the familiar comfort of her routine settle over her. Yet, even as she carried out her morning tasks, she couldn't shake the sense that something was different. The night with the young biker and the tension with the police seemed to have left a ripple she hadn't anticipated. It started with the phone. Calls, messages, texts, and social media notifications poured in almost all at once. Some were simple inquiries from locals, curious about the events of the previous evening. Others came from numbers she didn't recognize, and as she read through them, she realized that the news of her bravery had spread far beyond the neighborhood. People were reaching out from other towns, from other states even, praising her courage, sharing the story and expressing respect for the way she had stood her ground. She felt a mix of surprise and unease. She had acted on instinct, without thinking about consequences or recognition. She had simply done what she believed was right in that moment, helping someone in need. The idea that her actions were now being noticed, even celebrated, was both flattering and unnerving. She poured herself a cup of coffee, sitting behind the counter, and tried to focus on her work. But it was impossible to ignore the excitement and curiosity that seemed to be gathering around her diner. By late morning, strangers began to appear outside, lingering near the entrance, peering in through the windows. They weren't aggressive or threatening. They were just watching, waiting. Some waved politely, others nodded in quiet acknowledgement. She continued her work, serving pancakes and coffee, greeting her regulars with the same warmth she always had, but she could feel the growing energy outside. Something was building, and she wasn't quite sure what it would become. Around noon, the young biker from the night before returned, this time with a few friends. They walked in casually, but there was a quiet confidence in the way they moved, a sense of purpose that made her pause for a moment. They didn't act like typical customers. Their leather jackets were worn and patched with symbols she didn't recognize, their faces marked by experiences she could only guess at. But they carried themselves with respect, and it was clear from the start that they meant no harm. "We just wanted to say thanks again," the first biker said, nodding toward her. "What you did last night, it wasn't just brave. It was rare." She smiled faintly, trying to stay calm despite the tension in the air. "I only did what anyone would," she said. "You were in trouble. I wanted to help." He shook his head. "Most people wouldn't, not like that. You didn't hesitate. You didn't judge. You didn't panic. You just acted." She felt a lump in her throat but said nothing. There was nothing she could say to make it clearer why she had done it. It wasn't about recognition, it wasn't about fear, and it wasn't about being a hero. It was simply the right thing to do. As they sat and ate quietly, she observed them carefully. There was a sense of loyalty among them, an unspoken code that governed their actions. They spoke in low tones, careful not to draw too much attention, and occasionally glanced at her with subtle nods of appreciation. She realized that her diner had become more than just a place to eat. It was now a symbol of respect, a rare safe space where trust and courage intersected. Outside, more bikers began to gather. They didn't enter immediately, but the rumble of their engines and the glint of chrome bikes created a palpable energy. She peeked through the window and saw a crowd forming down the street. Some were riding slowly, others had parked nearby, all waiting for something or someone. She felt a twinge of nervousness, unsure how many were coming or why, but there was also a strange sense of pride. Her simple act of protection had resonated far beyond what she could have imagined. Throughout the afternoon, she served customers and continued her conversation with the bikers who had come inside. She asked them about their lives, their travels, and their experiences on the road. They answered cautiously at first, then more openly as the hours passed. She realized that they were not the frightening figures she had imagined the night before. They were people with stories, struggles, and a deep sense of community. They trusted her, in part because she had shown them kindness and courage without expecting anything in return. One of them, an older man with streaks of gray in his hair, spoke quietly as he sipped coffee. "You don't understand," he said. "Not many people would do what you did. You risked yourself just to give someone a chance. That's respect. That's honor." She shook her head, unsure how to respond. "I didn't think about risk," she said. "I just wanted to help." He smiled, a small, knowing smile. "That's why it matters," he said. "Because it was genuine. Because it wasn't about fear or rules. It was about doing what's right." As the day wore on, the number of bikers outside continued to grow. Some parked nearby, others circled slowly, curious about the diner and the woman who had become the topic of conversation across their community. She felt a mix of anxiety and fascination. This was new territory for her. She had faced difficult situations before, but never on this scale, never with this kind of attention. Despite the growing crowd inside the diner, there was a sense of calm. The bikers who had entered were polite, quiet, and respectful. They shared small stories of the road, laughed softly, and occasionally nodded toward her in gratitude. The young man from the previous night sat quietly, his expression a mix of relief and awe. He seemed genuinely touched that she had acted without hesitation, without judgment and without fear. By evening, the story had spread even further. People from nearby neighborhoods came to see the diner for themselves. They didn't know all the details, but they had heard enough to understand that something extraordinary had happened here. Her actions had created a ripple effect, inspiring respect and curiosity far beyond her expectations. She went about her work as usual, serving food and cleaning tables, but her thoughts kept returning to the events of the day. She realized that her act of courage had not only helped the young biker, it had created a bridge between her and a community she had never known. The bikers respected her, not because she was loud or aggressive, but because she had stood her ground calmly and with integrity. As night approached, the diner emptied slowly. The bikers who had come inside left, nodding their thanks, and those outside continued to linger, keeping an eye on the building with quiet reverence. She locked the doors, cleaned the counters one last time, and took a deep breath. The day had been long, exhausting, and surreal, but it had also been rewarding in ways she could barely put into words. Sitting alone for a moment, she reflected on what had happened. She had acted on instinct, guided by compassion and a sense of fairness. She had offered safety, food, and a listening ear, and in return she had earned respect, trust, and admiration. She realized that sometimes even small actions could create waves that spread far beyond the immediate moment. She didn't know what tomorrow would bring. She didn't know how many more bikers might come, how far the story might travel, or what challenges might arise. But she did know one thing. She would continue to act with courage and kindness no matter the situation. That was who she was. That was how she lived. And somewhere deep inside she felt a quiet anticipation. The events of the next day promised to be even more extraordinary, and she knew she would face them the same way she faced every challenge, with strength, integrity, and a calm heart. The next morning began like any other, with the aroma of coffee drifting through the diner and the clatter of pans and dishes filling the small space. She arrived early, unlocking the doors and letting the warm light spill across the floor. She had gotten used to the idea that her simple diner had become a story people were talking about. Still, she couldn't quite predict what the day held. She set about her routine, wiping counters, brewing coffee, and flipping eggs on the griddle, trying to keep everything as normal as possible. By late morning, the sound of motorcycles in the distance caught her attention. At first, it was just a low rumble, but it grew louder and more constant. Then she saw them, a long line of motorcycles stretching down the street, their chrome shining in the sunlight, their engines creating a deep, rolling hum that could be felt as much as heard. Her heart skipped a beat. She had expected a few curious bikers, but this was something entirely different. She stepped outside, trying to gauge what was happening. The line of bikes seemed endless, and soon she realized that there must be nearly 200 riders moving slowly toward the diner. The young man from the night before rode near the front, nodding toward her as he passed, a silent reassurance. She froze for a moment, a mix of fear, awe, and uncertainty washing over her. Inside the diner, she took a deep breath and steadied herself. She had faced tense situations before, but this was unlike anything she had imagined. The bikers were not rushing or aggressive. They rode with a sense of purpose, moving in formation as if every movement had meaning. It was intimidating and strangely beautiful at the same time. She realized quickly that they were not here to cause trouble. They were here because of her, because of what she had done the night before. The first riders began to park outside the diner, lining their bikes carefully along the street. The hum of engines faded into a low, steady murmur, and the sheer presence of so many people created an energy that was almost tangible. She watched as the young man she had helped the previous night dismounted, walking toward the diner with a few others. Each one nodded or waved politely, acknowledging her with a quiet respect that made her chest tighten. She opened the door and stepped outside, keeping her voice calm but firm. "Welcome," she said, trying to project the confidence she didn't fully feel. "Please just enjoy yourselves. You're welcome here, but let's keep it peaceful." The bikers nodded, some smiling faintly, others remaining silent, but there was a mutual understanding. They were here to show respect, not to intimidate or demand anything. She realized that what she had done had created a bridge between her and a community she had never known. They valued loyalty, courage, and integrity, and she had demonstrated all three in her actions. As more riders parked, the diner began to fill slowly with the sound of conversations and soft laughter. Inside, she served coffee and simple plates of food to those who chose to come in. She kept her movements calm, pouring drinks, placing plates, and engaging in quiet conversation. Each interaction was brief but meaningful. She noticed the pride in their eyes, the subtle glances exchanged between them, and she understood that they were testing the space, making sure it was safe and acknowledging her bravery. Outside, the motorcycles created a wall of chrome and leather. People passing by slowed down, curious about the sight. Some took pictures from a distance. Others whispered to each other about the woman who had stood up to the police and protected one of their own. It was surreal for her to watch. She had never sought attention or admiration, yet her actions had drawn people from far and wide. The young man she had helped approached again, this time bringing a few others with him. "We wanted to make sure you're okay," he said. "You don't know how much this means to us, what you did for me. Not many people would have had the courage to act the way you did." She shook her head, trying to stay humble. "I didn't do it for recognition," she said. "I just did what I thought was right." He smiled faintly, and she could see the relief in his eyes. "That's exactly why it matters," he said, because it was genuine. Throughout the afternoon, the bikers remained, some sitting quietly on the patio, others leaning against their bikes, chatting softly. She continued to serve food and drinks, moving carefully between tables and keeping an eye on the growing crowd outside. She realized that her diner had become more than a place to eat. It had become a symbol, a space where respect and trust could exist between very different worlds. People began to share stories among themselves, quietly, about the events of the previous night and the bravery she had shown. There was laughter, quiet admiration, and a sense of community forming around her small diner. She noticed how the bikers interacted with each other, their loyalty and respect for one another evident in every gesture and word. It was a culture built on trust, honor, and shared experiences, and she was witnessing it firsthand. By evening, the crowd had grown even larger. Nearly all 200 bikers were parked outside, their presence commanding but not threatening. Some had ventured inside for food and coffee, while others remained outside, keeping a respectful watch. She cleaned tables, refilled coffee, and continued to engage in quiet conversation, her calmness helping to ease the tension she initially felt. She realized that her actions the night before had not only helped one man, they had created a ripple effect that extended far beyond her expectations. People were talking, sharing the story, and acknowledging the courage it took to act with integrity in a moment of tension. She felt a deep sense of satisfaction, not from recognition, but from knowing that standing up for what was right could create such a meaningful impact. As night fell, the rumble of motorcycles began to fade, but the sense of presence remained. The bikers who had come inside left slowly, nodding and waving, while those outside maintained their vigil until darkness settled. She locked the doors, wiped down the counters, and leaned against the wall, taking a moment to breathe. The day had been intense, surreal, and exhausting, yet it had also been extraordinary. Sitting alone for a few moments, she reflected on the events. She had acted out of compassion and courage, offering safety and kindness without expecting anything in return. That simple act had resonated with a community known for loyalty, strength, and respect. She realized that even ordinary people could have extraordinary impact when they acted with integrity and heart. She didn't know what tomorrow would bring. She didn't know how far the story would travel, or how many more people might come to her diner. But she did know one thing. She would continue to act with courage, compassion, and calmness no matter the situation. That had guided her this far, and it would guide her through whatever came next. As she finally went upstairs to her apartment above the diner, she felt a quiet pride and a sense of anticipation. The events of the day had been remarkable, and she knew that the story of her bravery and kindness would continue to grow. She rested, knowing that her small diner had become a place of trust, respect, and extraordinary connection, a place where even the most unlikely alliances could form through simple acts of courage and integrity. The next morning, the diner opened like any other, though there was a quiet energy in the air that she couldn't ignore. The sun shone bright, reflecting off the stainless steel of the tables and the polished counters. The smell of coffee and fresh bread filled the room, and she moved through her usual routine, preparing pancakes, bacon, and eggs while humming softly to herself. But even in the rhythm of her everyday work, she felt the lingering presence of the bikers from the day before. By mid-morning, A few riders began to arrive again, though this time they were calmer, quieter. They didn't block the street or fill the area with engines roaring. Instead, they parked in neat rows and approached the diner respectfully, their eyes filled with gratitude and recognition. She greeted them at the door, offering smiles and nods, careful to remain calm. She knew that their presence was powerful, and she wanted to make sure everyone felt safe, including herself. Some of the bikers came inside to sit at the counter, drinking coffee and quietly chatting with her. Others remained outside, leaning on their bikes or standing in small groups watching the street. There was no tension this time, only a sense of respect and acknowledgement. She served food, listened to stories of the road, and kept conversations light, making sure everyone felt welcome but not intrusive. The young man she had helped the first night came in once again. He walked confidently, though there was still a hint of nervousness in his eyes. "I wanted to make sure you're okay," he said. "After yesterday, everything. We wanted to show our appreciation." She shook her head, still humble. "I'm fine," she said. "I just did what I thought was right. That's all," he smiled softly. "That's why it matters so much. Because it was real. Because it wasn't about fear or attention or even about us. It was about what you believed was right." The diner was busier than usual now, but the atmosphere was calm. Locals came in, curious about the visitors, and she served them with her usual warmth. Some of the customers whispered to each other about the events that had unfolded, about the woman who had stood up to the police and protected one of the bikers. She didn't seek attention, but she could see how her actions had begun to inspire admiration. Throughout the day, more bikers trickled in, each one showing respect in their own way. Some offered small gestures, a nod, a wave, a quiet word of thanks. Others simply observed from a distance, ensuring that the diner remained a safe and peaceful space. She realized that the simple act of protecting someone had created an unexpected ripple of trust and loyalty, something that extended far beyond the diner's walls. By mid-afternoon, the bikers began to prepare to leave. It was a quiet, almost ceremonial departure. They mounted their bikes in organized lines, engines rumbling softly, and began to move down the street, their formation precise but not aggressive. She watched as they passed, the young man who had first come to her diner giving a final nod of thanks before riding off. The line of bikes stretched down the road, fading into the distance, leaving her standing outside the diner with a mixture of relief, awe, and gratitude. Inside, she closed the doors for a moment and leaned against the counter, taking a deep breath. She reflected on the past 2 days, on how something so simple, offering help to someone in need, had created a connection that she could never have anticipated. She realized that courage wasn't about fighting or confrontation. It was about standing firm, acting with integrity, and treating others with respect, even in the face of uncertainty. Her regular customers returned in the late afternoon, unaware of the full extent of what had happened. She served them with her usual warmth, chatting and laughing, but inside she felt a quiet pride. The diner had become more than just a place to eat. It had become a symbol of trust, respect, and courage. People came not just for the food, but for the sense of safety and community that she had cultivated, a space where everyone could feel seen and valued. Word of the event spread beyond the neighborhood. Locals shared the story with friends and family, social media posts circulated, and soon people from nearby towns were calling or stopping by, wanting to hear firsthand about the woman who had stood up to the police and protected a member of a biker community. She listened politely to the inquiries, answering simply, never boasting, just recounting the events as they had happened. She realized that her actions had left a lasting impression, not only on the bikers who had visited, but also on the broader community. People were inspired by her courage and her calm, compassionate response in a tense situation. They saw that even ordinary people could make a difference, that small acts of bravery could resonate far beyond a single moment. That evening, she sat in the empty diner, cleaning and organizing, reflecting on the experience. She thought about the bikers, their loyalty to each other, and the respect they had shown her. She realized that respect was earned not by force or intimidation, but by courage, integrity, and kindness. She felt grateful for the lessons she had learned, and for the way her simple decision had created bonds that transcended differences. As night fell, the street outside her diner was quiet again. The hum of engines was gone, replaced by the normal sounds of the neighborhood. Cars passing, dogs barking, the occasional footstep on the sidewalk. She locked the doors and leaned against the counter, taking a final moment to breathe and reflect. Her life had returned to its usual rhythm, but it had been forever changed. She had discovered the power of standing firm, the impact of courage, and the unexpected ways in which kindness could ripple through a community. She knew that people would remember her actions for years to come, and that the diner would hold a special place in the stories told about loyalty, bravery, and integrity. She didn't seek fame or recognition, but she understood that her actions had inspired others, creating a sense of connection and respect that she could never have predicted. In the quiet of her apartment above the diner, she finally allowed herself to rest. She reflected on the events, the bikers' departure, and the community that had formed around her small diner. She realized that courage could be quiet, patient, and simple, yet still profound. It wasn't about confrontation or attention. It was about doing what was right and standing firm. Even when it was difficult, her diner would continue to serve breakfast, lunch, and dinner, welcoming locals and travelers alike. But it would also stand as a symbol, a place where trust, respect, and courage could intersect, a reminder that even in ordinary lives, extraordinary moments could occur. The bikers' visit, their quiet respect, and the bonds formed in those 2 days had left a lasting mark, one that she would carry with her always. And as she drifted off to sleep that night, she felt a deep sense of peace. She had acted with integrity, helped someone in need, and witnessed firsthand the power of courage and respect. Her diner, once just a small corner of the neighborhood, had become a place of significance, a testament to the difference one person could make by simply standing firm and doing what was right.